and gave Abigail maybe the best light confirms in the game. Going from Season 2 to Season 3, Abigail's crouching light kick went from +3 on hit to +5, so it can now link into itself. But on top of that, crouching light punch and standing light kick went from 6 frame startup to 5 frame startup, so you could easily link into them as well. These changes gave you a confirm to light Abigail punch, or a 3-hit light confirm into EX Abigail punch. You ain't got time for things like reacting to what the opponent is doing. You're here to push buttons. Another notable thing about Abigail's light confirms is that they're just strong. Most characters' lights in Street Fighter V do 30 damage, with their crouching light kicks usually doing 20. All of Abigail's do 40 except for stand light kick, which does 50. And also, Abigail punch is just a good combo ender. The light one does 120 if you mash, and the EX does 170. And obviously having a 3-hit light confirm helps your damage, and 3-hit light confirms were exceptionally rare at this point in the game's lifespan. There's one more light normal that's definitely worth talking about, and that's crouching light punch. This move is infamous for being an incredible poke, and technically speaking, this patch features the best version of that poke for 2 simple reasons. The first reason is very simple. This is the only patch where it's a 5 frame normal instead of a 6 frame normal. Although, to be fair, from a little further out, it still hits on frame 6. The second reason is a little bit harder to convey, but it's still very important. Abigail's crouching light punch barely extended his hurt box before the hitbox appeared. This move shut a lot of characters down. It was really annoying, and if you can believe it, this aspect of it wasn't nerfed until Season 5. Now, there is one other incredibly fucked up aspect of Abigail's light normals, although, to be fair, this is less an issue with his light normals and more an issue with something else in his kit. For whatever reason, Abigail can tick into his light or EX command grab after 2 blocked light normals. All of Abigail's command grabs have significantly more range than they do in the final version of SF5. It's actually kind of incredible. That's the heavy version, which basically only hits point blank in the final version of SF5. Being in range for a command grab after 2 blocked light normals is very rare in Street Fighter V, and at the time, the only characters who could do it were Birdie with his EX command grab, or Zangief with light or EX SPD. The craziest part of all this is that Abigail's command grab was arguably even more rewarding than Zangief's. His light command grab did the exact same damage and stun, but gave a better knockdown. And his EX command grab, while not pro-invincible like Zangief's, was way more flexible because of the juggle state it put the opponent in. Even the follow-up to EX command grab that sacrificed damage for Oki did more damage and stun than Zangief's EX SPD, while also having great corner carry. Abigail in the final version of SF5 is not a grappler, and you can tell he was never meant to be a grappler. He's a brawler, a character with high health, huge normals, and good pressure, who just happens to have a command grab that he can occasionally sneak in to remind you that you can block forever. But in this version of the game, thanks to how overtuned he was and the state of the game's actual grapplers, he was probably the game's best grappler. Now, to point out one teeny tiny little flaw with Abigail's grappler shenanigans, while his EX command grab does give him Oki, because it's not the command grab that's netting the knockdown, he can't deny the opponent's back rise, which can hurt his Oki. This is an issue, but to be fair, willingly putting yourself closer to the corner against this fucking thing is maybe not a decision to be made lightly, so I don't know. However, if Oki off a command grab that the opponent couldn't back rise was what you were looking for, then you had to look no further than Abigail's run grabs. The meterless run grab left you close and +5 after a dash, and the EX1 left you point blank +4. To be fair, he also had this in Season 2, but that doesn't make it any less fucked up. Moving on to Abigail's medium normals, there's honestly not a ton to say, but that's not because they're bad by any means. They're mostly fantastic, with the exception of stand medium kick. This normal has never done anything for Abigail throughout Street Fighter V's entire lifespan. It did get buffed going from Season 2 to Season 3. It has a better hitbox than it did in Season 2, and it went from 0 on hit to +2 on hit, making it easier to press things after and giving a link on counter hit, although admittedly not a very useful one. This is supposed to be a poke, but you have to be very close to actually get the link, so I don't really see how this is useful. As a poke, this move is just completely redundant. It's too slow, too stubby, and doesn't lead to anything meaningful without a V-trigger cancel. The only noteworthy thing about it is the fact that it's his strongest medium at 80 damage, but even then, that doesn't really mean anything. This move was buffed again in the final balance patch, going from +2 to +5 on hit, and even then you never saw it. Abigail's other medium normals are pretty fantastic. It's just that they're not uniquely fantastic, so I don't have a ton to say about them. They're not that much better here than they are in the final version of SF5, it's just that they're on a much better character. Abigail's stand medium punch is an incredible pressure tool. It's +7 on hit, +5 on block. It's a frame late on most crouching characters, so it's +8 and +6 respectively, and it combos into itself on counter hit. It also has very solid range and very little pushback. In the final version of Street Fighter V, this move is actually at worst +8 on hit, which is actually quite nice. It makes the link to back heavy punch a bit more consistent, because that hits on frame 8 in its later active frames. In this version of the game, you have to be very close for the link to work, which is key because it's a very, very important link. Funnily enough, Abigail's stand medium punch is one of the few things in his kit that was strictly nerfed going from Season 2 to Season 3. It had its hurt boxes adjusted to make it a worse anti-air, which is totally reasonable. It was probably not ever meant to be an anti-air in the first place, so this makes perfect sense. Crouching medium punch is a phenomenal poke. Like standing medium punch, this is another move that was technically nerfed going from Season 2 to Season 3, getting its hitbox made smaller, but in practice it doesn't really matter. The horizontal range is the exact same, so this was probably done to stop it from accidentally hitting people out of the air. It's also special cancelable, which can be potentially nice, although you don't get a combo from max range. You can cancel into flip to potentially net plus frames if the opponent respects it. And even if you don't think the opponent is going to respect it, there is some riskier stuff you can try. Crouching medium kick is another fantastic poke. It hits low, it's special cancelable, and unlike crouching medium punch, you can always combo off it at max range. And unlike the last two moves, this one was actually buffed going into Season 3, getting its hurt box reduced. It's a little slow at 12 frame startup, but one thing that was nice about this move is that it had a 16 frame special cancel window, so you could single hit confirm it into EX Abigail punch. Again, this has always been possible, and it's still possible today, but I feel like you didn't see Abigail players go for this until the later seasons. These were simpler times for Abigail. He had better things to be doing than reacting to things. He was just fine without that. Abigail's forward medium punch overhead hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. It's basically the same move it is now. Pretty slow, good range, +3 on hit, and -8 on block. Still, this move is the best it's ever been on this version of Abigail, because if it hits on its last active frame, or counter hits, it's +5, and this version of Abigail is the best at getting a conversion in that situation. Now, before we get onto Abigail's heavy normals, I'd like to go on a little bit of a tangent and talk about his jumps. Shouldn't be, given the kind of character he is, and his mobility is a genuine weakness. His walk speed is pretty subpar, his forward dash is tied for the slowest in the game at 25 frames, and in terms of distance travelled, his forward jump covers the least distance in the game by a huge margin. with characters like Young Zeku, Ibuki, and Bison jumping over twice as far. He also has the most pre-jump and landing frames out of any character, at 8 and 6 respectively, which is the same as Melee Bowser, which is unrelated but I think is kind of cute. However, while Abigail's forward jump isn't great for mobility, it can be incredibly frustrating on offense. For a start, out of every forward jump in the game, his spends the least total time in the air, at 36 frames, which at the time was maybe the single best one-button anti-air in the game. If you didn't have consistent anti-airs, you were completely cooked against Abigail. And if your anti-airs were a bit more committal, you could be in massive trouble, because Abigail's shallow jump but massive jump-ins meant that he could very easily bait committal anti-airs. This is such a terrifying situation, because you can't really afford to not anti-air Abigail. You can't let this character get in, you just can't let him jump at you. And wouldn't you know it, jumping heavy kick, this absolutely ludicrous button, was buffed going from Season 2 to Season 3, having its hurt box reduced. And not only that, Abigail's jumping heavy punch had its hitbox expanded, and to be fair, using this as a jump in is a little bit tricky. You have to hit it quite deep to get it to work. But rightfully so, because it's the strongest jump in the game at 110 damage. The last notable jump normal to be buffed was Abigail's jumping medium kick. It received 2 extra active frames going from 3 to 5, and it had its hitbox expanded. This is Abigail's cross-up, and while he has to be pretty close to use it, it's incredibly good. It can be very hard to tell what side he's going to end up on. And on top of that, because it's a medium, it has enough hit stun to go into his mediums, which allows you to get much bigger combos. Moving on to Abigail's heavy normals, we've already talked about crouching heavy punch, so we'll move on to Abigail's stand heavy kick and crouch heavy kick, which both received minor improvements going into Season 3. Stand heavy kick has never really been that important of a normal for Abigail. It can work as a low crush, but it's quite slow at frame 18, and it's -8 on block. In Season 3, it was changed to give a much more lenient juggle stay, although you really needed V-trigger cancel to get any kind of significant follow-up. And even then, juggles into crouching heavy punch, which were the most rewarding, didn't work at max range. In that scenario, you only got the first hit of sweep, which was unfortunately pretty weak. Speaking of sweep, that was typically preferred for activating V-trigger since it was faster, had more range, and left the opponent grounded. Going from Season 2 to 3, the first hit of sweep received an extra active frame, so it technically became a little bit better for this purpose, which is wild because it was already really good for it, although it is quite a minor buff. Now, I did mention earlier that it got some hitbox and hurtbox improvements going into Season 3, but either way, forward heavy punch isn't very good. It's not a very good anti-air, and while its frame data is pretty good, being +4 on hit and +1 on block, unfortunately, it works against the entire cast if they're crouching. So that pretty severely limits its utility. Its only real uses are in some niche V-Trigger 1 stuff and in juggles, and admittedly it is very good in juggles. Better in this patch than it is in any other version of the game. Back heavy punch on the other hand is absolutely monstrous. For a start, this is a frame 7 cancelable heavy, so it's fantastic in his combos. And it also has a target combo attached to it, and it's a very good one. You sacrifice a little bit of damage for good corner carry and fantastic Oki. Back heavy punch also had 1 hit of projectile durability, which on a character like Abigail was much appreciated. Granted, it wasn't as good of an anti-fireball tool as something like Zangief's Headbutt. It had a good bit more recovery, although it did build you a fair bit of meter, and you could at least cancel it on hit, although this was rather committal. The combination of its good speed and target combo also make back heavy punch a fantastic whiff punishing tool. Now, to be fair, whiff punishing wasn't as prevalent in this version of SF5 as it was in the later versions, since buttons tended to have less recovery, but that wasn't a massive issue for some reasons we're going to talk about now. Everything I just said about back heavy punch also applies to back heavy punch in the final version of Street Fighter V, but don't get it twisted, this version of the move absolutely has some exclusive dirt. First of all, I did mention that earlier versions of Street Fighter V tended to be less focused on whiff punishing, and that absolutely applies to this move, because you're not whiff punishing this. Abigail not risking a ton by whiffing this button was unbelievable, because the combination of it being fast, very rewarding, and a heavy button, meaning it would beat medium pokes in trades, meant that he could use it less as a whiff punish tool, and more of a let's just hope I hit something button. Next up we've got another very notorious button, and that's Abigail's standing heavy punch. It's very slow at frame 20, but it has more than enough to make up for that, especially in this version of the game. First of all, as you can tell, it's absolutely massive. It hits from over 2 backdashes away, and on top of that, it's actually safe on block at -3. It's also an extremely rewarding crush counter. From any range you can dash in and get back heavy punch for Oki, or crouching heavy punch for damage. Now again, pretty much all of that applies to the final version of this move as well, but this is the best version of it, and I'll get into why now. First of all, this crush counter is more rewarding here than it is in any other version of the game. The move itself does more damage and builds more V-meter on crush counter than it does in the final version. The crush counter scaling nerfs weren't in play yet, and in general, this version of Abigail gets the most damage and stun after a crush counter. So this move is basically the same as it is in the final version of the game on block, but it's more rewarding on hit here. This button is nigh on whiff punishable, it's absolutely disgusting. And look, I know I've already mentioned that the earlier versions of Street Fighter V were less focused on this kind of thing, but it really is absurd just how little Abigail risked by throwing this out. Especially considering how potentially massively rewarding it is. Anyways, let's move on to Abigail's specials. I've already touched on some of them, but there's still plenty worth pointing out. First of all, Abigail Punch. Abigail Punch is really just a combo ender for Abigail, and in this version of the game, wouldn't you know it, it's a better combo ender than it is in the final version. The damage of the meterless Abigail punches has never changed. They've always done 120, 130, and 140 respectively, although they do 50 more stun here than they do in the final version of the game. 200 versus 150. EX does 170 damage and 230 stun, which is 10 more damage and 30 extra stun than the final version of the game. What really separates Season 3 Abigail Punch from Final Season Abigail Punch though, is the fact that the meterless Abigail Punches all give you Oki in this version of the game. The light Abigail Punch gives you the worst Oki, leaving you +4 after a dash on Quick Rise, but the furthest away. Medium and Heavy leave you much closer, and after a dash on Quick Rise, you're +3 and +4 respectively. It's not perfect Oki or anything, but it's still terrifyingly good for the kind of character it's on. EX Abigail Punch gives you the most advantage but the worst knockdown. It's Oki, but mid-screen it's not ideal. A weird quirk of Abigail Punch is the fact that you had to mash punches during the move to increase its damage and stun. For the meterless versions, if you didn't mash, you lost 20 damage, 20 stun, got less advantage on knockdown, but were left closer to the opponent.